So next headline here is LSD off switch developed by Psychedelic Pharmaceutical Company. So this one's pretty interesting. Obviously, there's been a surge of alternative medicines, psychedelic medicines. Part of the problem with LSD as compared to some other treatments is that the effects can last 8 to 12 hours. So if you're looking for a targeted therapeutical session, an hour or so, much harder when you're tripping for 8 to 12 hours. What this article is about is that this pharmaceutical company has developed basically a way to turn it off. So take acid, get the effects, but we're able to cut it off in a short amount of time, either to keep the session short, or if someone starts to have a bad trip, being able to move beyond that as well. So kicking it off, question to you all. I have been seeing a lot of these new psychedelic health companies cropping up, magic mushrooms, ketamine, ayahuasca, all kinds of things. How far are we from large-scale adoption of these, or will we even ever reach that? I mean, we saw all kinds of regulatory hurdles with medicinal marijuana, which now seems, in a funny way, benign almost. Where are we going to be with the world of these crazy psychedelic drugs?
So there's two questions in there. One, putting my investor hat on, will these be successful for investors? Will they make money for investors? And then the second question is, would you consider consuming these? For the past month and a half or 2 months, since we've been kind of sheltered in place here, I have completely cut my consumption of caffeine and alcohol to zero. So I may not be the typical customer here, and I would probably never use stuff like this. But from an investor perspective, I think a lot of this goes back to branding and marketing. And so I think that if this stuff is marketed properly and targeted at the right audience, at the right market, then I think it could become successful. But that's a universe that's a lot different from what I typically do day to day.
I mean, I think this is a classic case of the consumer and customer being way ahead of the politicians and the frameworks of legality. I mean, some of this stuff, if you go back, LSD has obviously been around since the 40s, and if you go back to the 50s and 60s, there was actually an LSD brand that was used medicinally. That was a medical brand, and then I think the IP ran out in the end of the 60s. But then, of course, the US and the UN, I think, made it illegal as a controlled substance. So we're only just at the beginning of the research actually being even allowed again. Certainly in many Western countries, I don't know about others, but only in the last few years have these companies even been allowed to apply for licenses to do research on the benefits for mental health or other things. And prior to that, any research even done in labs and universities funding could often only be granted if they were going to prove that these things were bad for you, which is not a great place to start doing scientific objective research. So I think we will see more and more of these. I think even with the cannabis and CBD, we're at the very, very, very beginning of the curve, because there's lots of challenges around, strength and controlling the strength, which is ultimately what causes mental health problems for many people. It's not the substance itself; it's just the fact that a spliff these days is 50 times stronger than it was in Woodstock, right? So I think we're going to see a huge amount more, but I think it's going to take way, way longer for governments and essentially the war on drugs to catch up, and then we're probably talking decades.
Yeah, I totally echo that. I think personally, from looking quite a lot into this, I think, and I was not a doctor, but I think it's quite clear that altering your consciousness in some ways can be a good way to explore your mind and to can have beneficial effects. That is essentially what you're trying to do with therapy, obviously not using substances. I think there's something very interesting here, and I think it's clear that it's been a political choice not to look into this kind of treatment. But I think it's also, as just echoing what's being said before, I think this is a generational thing. It's not something that's going to take 3 years. I think it's going to take 30 years. If you take my generation, I'm in my late 20s. I think our attitude towards cannabis, for example, is obviously different than our parents, but that has taken a long time, right? And I still have friends who will just vehemently deny that there can be any benefits or that cannabis can be consumed in a way that doesn't cause you problems. So I think it's interesting, but I think it's also feels far away from me.
I think that I read somewhere that like a designer drug, an illegal street drug is a new compound is discovered almost weekly in Europe. I don't know about the US, on the streets, and that's a big problem, right? And it's actually, worse than allowing some of these things to be properly studied and made available in a controlled way, in my opinion, anyway. There's also some interesting stuff. A guy called Professor Nutt, would you believe, used to be the head of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs for the UK government up until about 2010. And he released a report saying that, a scientific report saying that, laws should be relaxed and they should be analysed, so they fired him. But he's now started a company called Alcarel, which is a new compound which is supposed to replace alcohol, have similar effects, but without any of the downside. I know he's attempting to get that tested and get sort of FCA approval for that. So there's some interesting stuff going on, I think.